Welcome to the Eternal format, the unofficial format where every set is legal, from the original base set to the most recent set, with a ban list to keep things balanced. To learn more about the Eternal format, check the links in the description. Up first, we're going to be looking at Bastiodon Noivern, which is the deck that I played in this game. It is an early testing deck because the Bastiodon is not out yet. It's expected to come out with Pitch Black in July. Bastiodon has an ability that says, as long as this Pokemon is on your bench, prevent all damage done to your Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon that have 2 or fewer energy attached. So the idea of this deck is to put 2 Bastiodon in play, so you will always have one on the bench even if the other one gets gasted, in order to prevent all damage done to your active, assuming that your opponent doesn't have too much energy on their active. In order to put 2 Bastiodon in play, we use Pokémon Research Lab, which is a stadium card which allows us to put 2 Stage 1 Pokémon from our deck onto your bench, as long as those Stage 1s evolve from an identified fossil. And with the Research Lab, we will always get 2 Shieldon. Using Pokémon Research Lab ends your turn, but we can just do this on turn 1, where we wouldn't attack anyway. And more than that, we can do it turn 1 going first. So this is a great tool for setup. This deck in particular operates under the assumption that the opponent's deck will most likely rely on special energy if they want to get their active Pokemon to have 3 or more energy attached. And so the attacker that I chose to pair with Bastiodon is Noivern GX, which is here mainly for its second attack, Dominating Echo. It costs effectively 1 Double Dragon energy, and it does 140 damage, and it says during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any Stadium cards or Special Energy cards. Noivern GX is also useful for its first attack, which does 70 damage and prevents all damage done to it by your opponent's basic Pokemon during their next turn. So that's useful in some other matchups where, for example, they have something like Deluge Blastoise to attach energy to their basic attackers. If they are basic, they cannot hit Noivern after you use Covered Flight. Yeah, other than that, we also have both Big Parasol and Gift Energy to prevent our Noivern from being affected by effects of attacks, since Bastiodon only prevents damage. Next, I will be talking about Dollstall, which is the list that was built and played in this game by Cooki. This too is a first draft of this list, actually just like mine was. The idea of this deck is to constantly use Lillie's Pokédoll, which is an item card that can be played as a basic Pokemon essentially, and which grants no prize cards when it's knocked out. The idea is to always have a Pokédoll in the active, and on your bench you're gonna have Ribombee, which has an ability that prevents all effects of the opponent's supporter cards done to your fairy Pokemon in play. So if you have a doll in the active and all fairy Pokemon on the bench, your opponent cannot use Guzma to bring up something that is actually worth some prize cards. It also has Cleffa, which has an ability that allows you to flip a coin, and if heads, you shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 6 cards, and either way, this ends your turn, but since you're not using an attack anyway, this is what the deck does instead of attacking. To recover your Pokédolls from the discard pile, the main way is Silene, which is a supporter card that lets you flip 2 coins, and for each heads you take a card from the discard pile and put it on top of your deck. It also has Gardevoir GX, which has a GX attack which lets you shuffle 10 cards from your discard pile into the deck, so that's the other way you can recover the dolls. And yeah, other than that, there are just a large assortment of tools that are annoying for your opponent. You might wonder what Gardevoir and Sylveon-GX is doing in this list, and I asked Cooki about this, and he told me that it is here as an attacker for a specific matchup. Namely, this matchup is Banette Vileplume. In that deck, Vileplume has an ability or a Pokébody, depending on the specific Vileplume, which item locks both players, and the attacker is Banette X, which does damage proportional to how many trainer cards the opponent has in their hand. So the idea in this matchup, since you cannot play Lillie's Pokédoll under item lock, is to have Galarian Meowth on your bench, and use its ability to discard all the trainer cards from your hand, so that the opposing Banette is not gonna be able to hit for a large number. And then you use Gardevoir and Sylveon-GX as an attacker. So, moving on now to the game, I started Ditto Prism Star, which is a super cool Pokemon. It can evolve into any stage 1, but the catch is that it is a Prism Star, so you can only run one in your deck. Whereas my opponent started with Galarian Meowth, which is not really needed in this matchup, so it's maybe a bit of an unfortunate start. I went first, and I immediately played 2 Poké Pad to grab 2 Pokemon that don't have rule boxes, namely I grabbed Noibat and Baltoy. And after that, I played Pokémon Research Lab, which allows me to get 2 Shieldon, and luckily I also have the 2 Bastiodon already in hand for later. Then my opponent's turn, he benches Cutiefly and attaches a Wonder Energy to it. Wonder Energy essentially is the same as Mist Energy, preventing all effects of attacks, except it provides a Fairy Energy and can only be attached to Fairy Pokemon. And then he passes. The next turn, I put my 2 Bastiodon in play. I attach a Stealthy Hood to one of them, so if my opponent were to play some sort of ability lock like Garbodor, my Bastiodon will be unaffected by it. Then I attach a Float Stone to my active Pokemon, and I play Iono. Worth noting that I can play Iono despite it being the last card in my hand, because my opponent has cards in his hand, so this is indeed a legal play. So I draw 6 cards, and my opponent shuffles the hand to the bottom and draws 6. Then I find a Double Dragon Energy, which I can attach to Noibat. Double Dragon Energy providing 2 energy of any type, but can only be attached to a Dragon Pokemon. Then I play my Evolution Incense to get an Evolution Pokemon, and my Luxury Ball to get any Pokemon I want. Basically, this is a staple of the Eternal format. And with those, I grab Claydol, which another staple of the format, is arguably the best draw engine. It has a Poké Power which allows you once during turn to put up to 2 cards from your hand to the bottom of the deck, and then fill your hand up to 6 cards. And I also grab Noivern GX, which is the main attacker. I then use Claydol's Poké Power. I just put 1 Float Stone to the bottom of my deck, keeping Field Blower just in case, as well as Guzma, which is obviously an important card to get around dolls, assuming that your opponent's Rebombi allows you to do so. And then I draw 4 cards. Then I retreat my Ditto into Noivern GX and attack with Dominating Echo. So with that, I take my first prize card. By the way, I just want to let you know my prize cards precisely, which I know after price checking with my deck searches. I have 2 of my 3 Noivern GX prized. This is the only one that was in my deck. And I ran a 2-2 line of Claydol. 1 Baltoy and 1 Claydol were prized. And one other prize was Lapras. The last prize was one of the 3 Shieldon. If I were against a deck that was able to knock out my Noivern, I would be in deep trouble, because 2 of my attackers were prized. But luckily for me, I'm playing against a stall deck, so that's not something I have to worry about. Anyway, my opponent promotes Cutiefly, and then he benches Ralts as well as an Alolan Vulpix. It is not a Fairy type, as you can see. It does evolve into a Fairy type, Alolan Ninetales GX, which is a useful Pokemon for setup, given that when you play it from hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you get to search your deck for 2 item cards. But right now it's a massive Guzma liability, since it's not protected by Rebombi. Then my opponent plays Twins, which can only be played when you're behind on prize cards, and lets you get any 2 cards you want from the deck. So very good card in basically any deck that does not attack. Then the Rebombi comes into play, and my opponent also benches Lillie's Pokédoll. Rebombi has free retreat, so they can just retreat into the doll and pass. Now, unfortunately for my opponent, I do have Guzma to hand down the Vulpix. After that, I attach Mist Energy to Ditto Prism Star. The idea is that if I ever get to evolve this Ditto into an Noivern GX, I am working towards being able to use Cover Flight. And after that, I use Claydol's ability, Claydol's Poké Power, to draw more cards. I do get to Pokémon Research Lab, which is not the most useful card in the world after turn 1. And then I attack once again with Dominating Echo, getting a prize card. My opponent promotes the free retreat Rebombi. Then he plays yet another Twins. And he finds Lost Remover. which allows them to choose one of my special energy in play and put it into the Lost Zone. Unsurprisingly, they chose my active Pokemon's Double Dragon Energy, so I will need to find another one next turn if I want to attack again. Then he benches a Cleffa and once again retreats into the Buckadol, and he uses Cleffa's ability. In this occasion, he flips heads, so he's able to shuffle the hand into the deck and draw 6 cards. And then their turn ends. I then draw for turn, and I find an Evolution Incense, but actually, let me see. Let me show my deck. The only evolution Pokemon in the deck is Bastiodon, the rest are all in the prize cards, as I showed earlier, so I just failed this search. Then I bench Lapras, yet another staple card of the format. It has the support navigation Poké Power, which allows you to search your deck for any supporter card when you play it onto your bench. There are, of course, other Pokemon with essentially the same power on the form of an ability, but those other Pokemon are worth 2 prize cards, whereas this Lapras is only worth 1. So this is why this is a lot of play. And with that, I get Guzma Hala, which I will be able to play to get a special energy card, provided that I discard 2 other cards from my hand. And with that, I chose to discard the 2 other copies of Research Lab, which are dead weight at the moment. This is a bit of a risky play because my opponent might eventually be able to put Wondrous Labyrinth into play. They currently cannot because I am attacking with Dominating Echo, but assume I somehow miss a bit, they will be able to put this into play, and I will need more energy in order to attack, which is not easy to achieve. And by discarding all of my remaining stadiums, I am essentially locking myself out of the option of bumping their Wondrous Labyrinth. So yeah, maybe I should have discarded something else, for example the Baltoy, since I know that the other Claydol is prized. But yeah, this is what I did. And yeah, the point of the play was to get a Double Dragon Energy in order to attack again. Then with Claydol's Poké Power, I draw a few more cards. And I attack with Dominating Echo, which does not get me any prize cards since I knock out a doll. Then my opponent with Ultra Ball gets yet again an Alola Vulpix, which, given that I have a Seeker for Guzma, you might be able to guess what I will do next turn. After that, they retreat their active and use Cleffa's ability, this time flipping tails, so he just passes. Like I said, I'll be a Seeker for Guzma, and I'm able to take another prize card. Before I attack, though, I use Claydol's Poké Power. And yeah, here comes another prize card for me. My opponent plays PAL Hand Extension, which is a very interesting card in this format. If you know Counter Catcher, this is essentially the same but better. It can only be played, it is an item card, it can only be played when you are behind on prize cards, and it gives you 2 options. You can either use it just as a Counter Catcher, or you can choose one energy card attached to the opponent's active Pokemon and move it to one of their bench Pokemon. In this case, they chose the Gust option, or the Counter Catcher option, and specifically they chose to Gust this Bastiodon, which has a 4 retreat cost. And it also already has a tool attached, the Stealthy Hood that I attached turn 1. So I will not be easily able to just attach a Float Stone to it and retreat it. Then my opponent retreats into the doll, and once again uses Cleffa's ability, this time flipping heads. Now, I am in a bit of a pickle because I need to retreat this Bastiodon, and the only option I have is to find the Field Blower in my deck, which would allow me to discard the Stealthy Hood, and then attach the Float Stone and retreat that way. It's worth noting that even though I have a VS Seeker, I cannot use Guzma to switch my active Pokemon, because Guzma only allows you to do so if you are able to Gust one of the opponent's Pokemon, and I'm not able to do that because of Ribombi's ability. So, the name of the game becomes trying to find the Field Blower, and since I have too many cards in hand, Claydol is not able to help me. So first thing I do is thin the deck out by playing 1 Poké Pad, and then I play Lillie's Determination, shuffling my hand into the deck and drawing 6 cards. None of those 6 cards are the Field Blower, although I do have a Float Stone ready. I do thin my hand for Claydol by playing yet another Poké Pad. And then with Claydol's Poké Power, I see a few more cards, but I still cannot find the Field Blower. So with nothing left to do, I attach yet another energy to Ditto and pass my turn. Then my opponent plays Peonia, which allows him to put 3 of their prize cards into their hand and then replace them with 3 cards from their hand afterwards. So this is obviously useful if you're not planning to take any cards to still have access to whatever you had prized. And then evidently my opponent likes the cards he has in his hand because he just passes without using Cleffa's ability. Now I draw for turn, and once again with Claydol I try to see more cards. Once again I do not find the Field Blower, and so I just pass. Then my opponent plays Celine, and they happen to flip 2 heads, so they put Lillie's Pokédoll on top of their deck, and then Lost Remover as the second card from the top. And then he passes. I finally top deck the Field Blower, so I am able to get Bastiodon out of there. And with Claydol's Poké Power I see a few more cards. Hilda is particularly useful because it's yet another supporter I can use to search for a special energy card after the Lost Remover, which will be coming. And then I attack once again with Dominating Echo, taking no prize cards. Then my opponent plays Team Rocket's Handiwork, which is a supporter that allows you to discard cards from the top of the opponent's deck, which is the win condition for my opponent's stall deck. However, these cards depend on coin flips, and my opponent flips 2 tails, which sort of balances the 2 heads he got with Celine, but whatever. And then afterwards he benches the Lillie's Pokédoll, which was stacked on top of the deck by Celine, and passes. I get to draw 1 card with Claydol, which is not a card that I particularly need, and then I attack with Dominating Echo. Once again, I get no prize cards for knocking out the doll. Lost Remover comes as expected. And once again, Lillie's Pokédoll is left in the active. This time around, my opponent does use Cleffa's ability, flipping heads. Worth noting, my opponent also attached a Fairy Energy to this Ralts on this turn. Ralts has an attack which can be useful in a pinch. It lets you put a supporter card from a discard pile into the hand, but once again the main point of the Ralts is the GX attack of Gardevoir GX to shuffle 10 cards from the discard into the deck. Anyway, I had a Double Dragon Energy already in my hand for Noivern X. Then with Claydol's Poké Power I get to see 2 more cards, and I attack once again Dominating Echo. My opponent plays Twins, once again getting 2 cards from the deck. He benches a Lillie's Pokédoll with a Tool Jammer attached, and once again plays Power Hand Extension to gast a Bastiodon. And he chooses to gast the Bastiodon that already had a Float Stone attached. However, the Tool Jammer here negates the effect of the Float Stone, so this Bastiodon still has the full for retreat cost. He could have gasted the other Bastiodon. I happen to have another Float Stone ready to go, so this doesn't make a difference. But yeah, I am left with a Bastiodon in the active. However, I am able with Claydol to find Faba, which will allow me to get rid of the opponent's Tool Jammer by sending it to the lost zone. And you will notice, by the way, I attached a tool to Noivern X because I noticed, and I discovered this during the game, actually I didn't notice it before, that Noivern also has free retreat, so it's not a problem to attach something that is not a Float Stone. And I also attached another energy to it, and this is to prepare for the Wondrous Labyrinth scenario. And once again, Dominating Echo. And yeah, my opponent promotes the Ribombi. Then he draws a card, and he plays Plumeria, which allows him to discard 2 cards from his hand in exchange for discarding 1 energy from one of my Pokemon. And the Double Dragon Energy gets discarded. Then afterwards he plays a Lost Vacuum, which allows him to get rid of the Float Stone attached to this Bastiodon. And then, since he cannot find a doll, he retreats into the Ralts, which is the most easy Pokemon to sacrifice in this scenario. And Cleffa's ability unfortunately flips tails, so he just ends his turn. I top deck my Double Dragon Energy, although I also had Hilda ready to go to grab it. Worth noting, this is my last Double Dragon Energy because 2 are in the Lost Zone and 1 is in the discard pile. Although I do have a Special Charge in the deck, so I will be able to recover those in the discard pile. And of course, if I get one of my 2 Noivern from the deck, from the prize cards, sorry, I will be able to attack with the first attack by evolving this Ditto Prism Star, assuming as always that Wandu's Labyrinth does not come into play. Anyway, I see more cards with Claydol, and this time around I am able to take a prize for Dominating Echo because I knock out the Rals. And I finally see one of my other Noivern GX. Silene once again flips 2 heads, and my opponent recovers 2 Pokédolls. And then Clef's ability flips tails. I then draw for turn, evolve my Ditto Prism Star into Noivern GX. Then I thin an Evolution Incense out of my hand, and then see more cards with Claydol. And at this point, my opponent chose to concede the game, so this is where the game ends. So, Bastiodon Noivern managed to win this game. It is still obviously a work in progress, this list. Most notably, you might notice the absence of Noivern GX, which is another important disruption Pokemon. Its first attack does 50 damage and item locks the opponent. It also has a second attack which costs 3 energy and does 120 while locking your opponent from playing special energy cards. And also a GX attack which spreads 50 to each of the opponent's Pokemon. Noivern GX would have been particularly useful in this matchup because of the item lock, which completely negates the doll strategy. However, I had cut it from earlier drafts when I played this game. I am considering handing it back, possibly 3 Noivern EX and 1 GX, or possibly 2 EX and 2 GX. This last one was what my opponent recommended after the game. I'm also not at all sure about the choice of a spec. I went with Unfair Stamp because it's a generically disruptive option, but I am also considering Megaton Blower to get rid of any special energy cards that were attached before I was able to attack with the Dominating Echo. There are, of course, plenty of other options to consider. I absolutely have not decided on that yet. Before we go, I want to show you another cool take on the Lillie's Pokédoll strategy, which is Doll Swap. The idea behind this deck is to use Clefairy's Doll Swap attack, which does 60 damage and lets you return the Clefairy to your hand and replace it with a Lillie's Pokédoll from your hand. The problem with this attack is that it costs 3 colorless, which is quite high for a basic Pokemon, but since this is the Eternal format, we have plenty of ways to go around this limitation. There are some Cleffa from the EX era, from the Diamond and Pearl era as well, which have the Baby Evolution Poké Power, which allow them to evolve into a Clefairy, even if it's the turn they were put into play, even if it's your first turn. And there is Boost Energy, which is a special energy card similar to Ignition Energy and to Triple Acceleration Energy, except it doesn't work with Evolution Pokemon, it works with Evolved Pokemon instead. And if your Clefairy evolved from a Cleffa, it is an evolved Pokemon, and so you can attach Boost Energy to it and fulfill the 3 colorless energy cost that way. And as a bonus, you don't have to discard Boost Energy at the end of your turn because it gets returned to your hand by the effect of Doll Swap. So, with that being said, thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions about the game or the list, feel free to comment below. Thanks again to Cookie for playing this match, and I'll see you next time.